Salam and hello. Welcome to Uproot. My name is Lily Bakala Piper, and as always, I am so grateful that you are with us today. Wherever you are in the world, I hope that you are healthy, you are safe, that your family is well. I mean, these days have been incredibly uncertain, incredibly hard for many of us, and I am thinking of each and every one of you. Over the last few weeks on the show, we have tried to think about the coronavirus pandemic from different angles. 2 weeks ago, my friend Dr. Michael Chung was with us, and he explained to us both the science of the pandemic and also how to stay well even if we get COVID-19. Last week, Julie Mwabe unpacked for us the patriarchy of the pandemic, and I learned a great deal from her expertise. If you have time, check out those episodes. I think you'll enjoy them and find them of good use to you and your community. Today on the show, we're going to talk about human rights in the middle of this pandemic. The Greek physician Hippocrates famously wrote the phrase, "do no harm," and those words are sacred to both medical professionals and human rights advocates who try and preserve health as a human right during crises around the world. Today on the show, it's my pleasure to welcome Irungu Houghton to Uproot. Irungu is the Kenya Executive Director of Amnesty International, and he was previously the Executive Director for Chapter 1 Kenya and the Society for International Development. Irungu has established an extensive US $2 million public interest campaign program that has expanded the right to association and has protected public school land and public resources from corruption over the last 4 years. In October, Irungu traveled to the Mexico-US border to advocate for African migrants, and Irungu is well known in Kenya and abroad as an inspirational speaker, change facilitator, and skillful moderator. He has a weekly column in the Sunday Standard, and it's something that I always make time to read, and he's currently writing a book on building constitutionalism in Kenya. He and his incredible wife, Robin, are social conscious leaders here in Nairobi. He's a parent, he's actively engaged in uplifting our community, and Irungu is a voice that we need during this very uncertain time. So it's really my honor and pleasure to welcome Irungu Houghton, Amnesty International Kenya Executive Director, to Uproot. Irungu, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to Uproot today. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you very much, Lily, and what extraordinary times we are facing.
Yeah, and truly, it's not where any of us thought we would be in the first of the year as we're making our resolutions. But Irungu, you have been at human rights work for a very long time with Amnesty and with other organizations. Let me ask you, outside of this extraordinary moment, what are your normal first priorities whenever there is a national crisis, whether it's elections or terrorism or otherwise? What are the things that rise to the top of your mind whenever a crisis begins in a country?
Well, first, obviously the first thing is keeping people safe. Secondly, keeping people engaged and keeping everything transparent and open so that we can see what's happening. Because, even in a case like COVID, one size cannot fit everything. And prescriptions that come down from the WHO may work in one part of the world, but in other parts of the world, they just don't work. So remaining conscious, I'm very fond of the words conscious leadership, that actually sitting in the space of what's happening. How do we interpret what needs to happen today, tomorrow, and over the next 90 days?
Absolutely. So, now here we are in the middle of COVID-19. Sub-Saharan Africa is probably in a different place than the rest of the world is, both in number of cases documented. Government response has been different here. How do you think this pandemic is changing or informing the human rights, work that you're trying to do right now?
It's like everybody else. It's disrupted the entire year, I think we need to look at this in a historical context. There was no universal declaration of human rights in the time of the bubonic plague, we're in like I said, an extraordinary moment because we have to fight this pandemic, but at the same time, we have to do this within a human rights framework and not just the right to health. but all the rights. I mean, one of the things that I think we've all struggled with, and it is really a testimony to how human rights conscious our lives are, is the taking away of freedoms that we had taken as really, kind of everyday freedoms. The freedom to worship together, the freedom to speak aloud, the freedom to move, the freedom to assemble. I mean, these were all things that many of us took for granted, which have come to an abrupt halt as we've had to implement these three basic measures: the stay-at-home measure, the physical distancing, and also, lastly, the concept of essentially remaining distance from each other.
Yeah, so in that context, let's maybe bring it down to our local context here in Kenya, because I think what we're seeing and learning here can be broadly applied. Every government is really wrestling with, like you said, the restriction of these freedoms that we don't even count as a freedom, right? We just take it for granted as the normal way we live our lives. So here in Kenya, we've seen we're now currently under a curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. There's restricted movement between counties for the next, I don't know what we are now. It was 21 days. I don't know how far we are now until probably a week.
April the 28th is the date.
Okay. Someone said the time has stopped timing. That's what I feel like. I never know what day exactly I'm in. So we still have some time also in that restricted movement. And in light of these restrictions, we've seen some police force that's been very heavy-handed. It's been tragic loss of life, including a young child that, really broke all of our hearts. Yasin Moyo. We've seen, abuse of power. Irungu, help us think through, how do we as citizens and how do we hold our governments accountable in a time where we both need their leadership and their protection, and yet we also want to maintain some sense of freedom and, autonomy? How do we balance those two?
Well, I think the first thing is just to say that we must not allow the Constitution and the various laws that frame our public behavior to be suspended at this time. We must continue to remind ourselves what they are. And secondly, also, we must remind our leaders and those that exercise state power that they're constantly regulated by those rights and those freedoms and those responsibilities. And obviously, in a case where you've got a pandemic that operates through physical proximity, this freedom of being able to move and to continue to interact with people is actually our greatest threat at this time. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense to impose a curfew and to reduce movement across different counties. And even, I suspect, depending on what the figures will be as we go into mass testing, we may even have to see movement restricted within particular counties as well. But I think the important thing is to recognize that at a time like this, you need all of society to engage. You can't manage this as a single executive or a single arm of government. It is really important to be clear, what is it that we have to do as a nation at this historic moment, and enroll people into that. What essentially we're doing is changing norms. We're changing public behavior. And that is not something that you can enforce and force people to do. You have to enroll them. You have to get them to understand that different choices are required at this moment, and that we do this out of compassion and out of care and a sense of solidarity with other people.
Absolutely. You've written, I mentioned your column in the Standard every week. You've written in the past about there is a role. In fact, interestingly enough, I came across your article from January when you were talking about we can't leave all of our good health in the hands of doctors. That's reckless and dangerous. And you pointed out good citizenship as being one way that we keep ourselves healthy. And of course, this is before the pandemic was widespread. And so it's a bit prophetic. In this moment, what does good citizenship look like then, in light of a time where sometimes there is overreach of government exercise to keep us safe? I mean, we're living in that tension day to day. You are not new to it. You've been working in this region for a long time. What is that balance between good citizenship and holding government to account in the way that human rights are preserved?
I mean, I think, active citizenship, good citizenship is doing a number of things. I mean, at this historic moment, it is staying at home. It is essentially, for those of you who are landlords, ensuring that your tenants are not evicted at this point. It is also sharing the little that we have across families. It is also not getting, protective personal equipment that should be reserved only for health workers and police officers. It is essentially, thirdly, it is really checking in with your neighbors and making sure that they too are protected at this time. So that's the first, what I call the very basic expectations of citizenship at this moment. But it is also looking out to how public resources are going to be managed. We, as Amnesty, have been focusing over the last 4 weeks on kind of three major things. The first is really ensuring that there is no stigma and discrimination that is directed towards people with COVID-19, that they are protected at this time and their privacy is protected. And you started off with this very powerful oath that has been there, I think, from 300 BC, which is the Hippocratic Oath. And one of the important things there is a mention of secrets, the holy secrets, that every human being in relationship to their medical condition must be protected at this time. So I think that's the first area of focus we've had. The second really has been around essentially making sure that communities that are very vulnerable, in the case of Nairobi, 2.5 million households don't have water regularly. They don't have security of tenure. They don't have houses or spaces that they can physically distance themselves from others. Many of them live in these 10 by 10, 10 foot by 10 foot shacks. And the prescriptions that came down from the WHO work very well for middle class, employed and formal sector households, but they don't work at all for informal sector households. So really kind of getting the government to focus on a number of things, like, for example, a moratorium on disconnections of water and electricity for 90 days, free water services for communities over these 90 days. And what's been really great is watching the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Water actually adopt these prescriptions that we released on World Water Day in mid-March. And I think the third area really has been around protection of people who go into mandatory quarantine. In Kenya, we've had, up until very recently, 2,000 people who were compelled to go into collective centers for a period of 14 days. And for many of them, their experience has been essentially that they have been able to self-isolate. They have been able to leave after 2 weeks, but for a number of them, they've not been able to do that either because the mandatory quarantine centers were mismanaged. They were recklessly, designed, and there was no oversight. So people basically commingled. I mean, we've had stories of even people having parties and getting alcohol brought in into these quarantine centers. And for that reason, they've had to extend the quarantine centers, but really making sure that the government is clear in terms of the prescriptions and the guidelines that, guide a mandatory quarantine center. And as we move into the more uglier and more frightening part of the COVID pandemic, which is essentially that, we will start to see numbers of people dying from COVID-19 going up, making sure that their burials and the services around the disposal of their bodies at this time is dignified, it is in keeping with their religious faiths, and that their families are not traumatized twice by the loss and then the disposal or the burial of their loved ones.
You've mentioned some really big ideas. I want to just kind of dig a little bit deeper into a few of them. What can we do as regular people to hold a government account around these issues around stigma? What do you think is the key linchpin to help us not get stuck in a place that we were around HIV/AIDS not that long ago?
I mean, I think the first thing is we have to give up the curiosity and the inquiry around what's happening to people with COVID-19. It is not our business. It is really not, a dignified way of engaging with somebody who's fighting for their life. We can't interrogate every aspect of their treatment and whether they got the dates right and when they flew into the country, traveled to which part of the country. That information is really not that important. It is the information of public health officers and epidemiologists to understand primarily from the point of view was how many people have come into contact with people who are positive with COVID-19, and essentially help those people to isolate, get testing, and protect themselves. It's the responsibility of the state. We've had, even senators, elected representatives, arguing for the naming of people who are currently affected with, who currently have COVID-19. And again, the good thing is that we have a number of laws and a constitutional principle that says that we have the right to privacy. In the same way that if I got COVID-19, I wouldn't want the whole of Twitter debating what's happening to me at this point. How did I get it? Who have I passed it on to? I think that's the line that we must hold for all citizens, that they have a right to privacy at this point. And the good thing is that the public health workers have had this built into either the patient's charter or their own code of ethics. I think as responsible citizens, we need to bake that into our own set of behavior and our own set of ethics at this time. And I think if we do that, we will really protect each other at this point, and we will make it easier for people to come out to the public health workers and say, I have symptoms, I need treatment.
I like what you're saying, because it's not an extraordinary effort to do this. It is basic common courtesy and doing what we do on a normal day. I think our region is known for warmth and hospitality. And so we exercise that now in the same way, in a different way, that we are, respectful and mindful and don't spread things. I mean, WhatsApp, I think, is blowing up every day with a new theory or a new, deep state idea. And I think keeping those to a minimum, bare minimum, and, only sharing facts and information and advocating for those who need help. You're right. It's a simple thing.
We're getting to a time where actually I think we're going to petition, I think it's Facebook, that they need to change the name of the app, which is What's Not App.
Yes, right. Absolutely. I want to talk about the second thing you mentioned about focusing on vulnerable communities. We've seen responses of varying degrees in our neighboring countries. Rwanda and Uganda have started food distribution programs in poor communities, those who are really, daily laborers who really cannot go out and earn their daily bread. Kenyan government this week released a directive that all giving should be funneled through the government, which of course raises some concerns and some questions. I think I'm wrestling with this idea of government response between, being kind of open democracies like Kenya is, and what we can do in preserving human rights. And at the same time, a response from a government that is complete and absolute and considers everyone in such a time. I think we're here in Kenya. There was so much debate a week ago about going to total lockdown, and people were saying, but how can you do that when people cannot feed their families? If you think you can lock someone down and they're hungry, you're misinformed. So help us navigate this kind of, it's in some ways it's an intellectual exercise, but it does play out in how we relate to one another. How do we balance this open democracy? And yet we don't have a government-wide feeding program yet. I don't know, your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a real fascinating discussion, and I'm sure, PhDs are going to be written on this for years to come. I've looked at different governments' approaches to, from the Singaporean model to the Chinese model, for example. And it's actually quite difficult to get a ideological, I guess what you'd call an ideological statement, which is democratic governments manage pandemics better than autocratic governments, because there are elements, I think, of both that are there. But what we have seen is that, where you don't try and centralize information, where you don't try and centralize service delivery or distribution of essential services, you can actually unleash the resources that are available in a society. The presence of an active free press is critical at a moment like this. And this is not the time to start controlling information. Yes, correcting inaccurate information, but really not beginning to persecute journalists or health workers for essentially pointing out where the weaknesses are in the system, as was in the case of the first couple of months of China. So I think what we really need to see, and if I come back to this, actually, the point you raised, which is a great moment. So yes, the government issued a directive after the breakdown of the distribution in Kibra I think it was on Friday. And you saw pandemonium. I mean, literally, you saw people crowding on each other. There is rumored to have been 2 deaths, not verified, but definitely a lot of injuries as people crowded to get access to this very limited contribution that was made by a member of parliament and managed by the security services. Fortunately, within 6 hours, that directive was rescinded with a new directive that says that those people who are generating essential supplies and distributing them simply have to notify the national mechanism, the resource fund that you're doing that, to make sure that the security provisions are put in place so that you don't have stampeding and you don't have people essentially spreading COVID as they try to get access to food supplies. But what I was struck with in that moment was not just the breakdown of the distribution service, but I was also struck by how hungry people were, how vulnerable people felt, that they actually needed to break into the chief's camp in order to try and get access to the food. And I think that does tell us that we are facing, many people are facing real difficulties with accessing just very basic food supplies that they need for their families. So I think coming back to this issue, I think what we need to do is we need to see government continuing to have a whole of society approach to how we deal with the different aspects of the needs that we are, and essentially trying to have a single pipeline will not work for the 47% of the population that are before the poverty line. We just don't have the capacity.
Yeah. And I appreciate you providing some clarity on that directive, because I think that's really important for us to understand here. And at the end of the show, I will highlight, I try to do this every week, a new organization that's giving out food stuff or health supplies or, supporting communities so that people can go to reliable places, because that is a real thing. The hunger levels at some point, as the whole world is experiencing actually this economic crisis that is coming on the heels of a health crisis, and both have to be managed well and effectively for sure. Let me ask you, we are also sitting in a time where, there's a lot of mistrust. And yet we don't want to create outrage simply. We want to create justice. One of my personal heroes is Brian Stevenson, and from the Equal Justice Initiative in the US. And he talks about how the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but the opposite of poverty is justice. So Irungu, in this moment in time, how can we create more justice without just creating alarm or outrage about inequities that we see or misappropriations of power? Because at the end of the day, just to make a lot of noise is not going to necessarily help my neighbor. So can you help us, guide us to how do we create more justice? We've talked about, minimizing misinformation and reducing stigma. Are there other ways that we can be active participants in helping our countries and our communities at this time?
I think if Brian Stevenson was in Kenya, he would probably point us to our constitution, and he would say that this is a great constitution, but for the 50% of the population, there is inequality under the law. So you can have great Bill of Rights provisions, but for the poor and the vulnerable and the marginalized, not just in the time of pandemic, but everyday life, many of those freedoms just seem like pipe dreams. And as I was once told in Kibra, the Constitution for us is like a calendar. It was, we saw it in 2010, and then, every year since that, we've had another calendar. It's not the Constitution that we guide, that we see in our everyday lives. So I think the first thing, with Amnesty, we have a couple of rules. One is that we focus on behavior, not people. So when we call out human rights abuses, whether it be police violence, our main focus is on the behavior and the actions that need to be taken to prevent this from happening, and justice for the victims. The second thing that we try and do is to look for the systemic reasons why this is happening. What are the systems that permit impunity? What are the systems that permit corruption? Then it actually has a massive potential ripple effect across the country and other forms of behavior that are happening. And then the third one really is to remain hope-based. It's extremely important in a moment like this that we don't descend into fatalism, cynicism, and a sense of recklessness that actually nothing matters, because everything matters. Everything that we do, not do, matters. So responsibility in a moment like this is really encouraging and enrolling people that actually your voice does matter, your agency does matter. Still matters in a pandemic. One of the great, sources of joy for me really has been watching my wife and a number of residents in the neighborhood of Kilimani essentially develop street marshals and train individuals who are standing up for their streets, so that if somebody is sick at night, if somebody needs emergency treatment, they can call the street marshal, and that street marshal can reach out to either the public health officer or the police officer in charge of our division, and ensure that there's safe passage for that person to get to a hospital. And I think that is active citizenship at this point, organizing ourselves to be able to take care of ourselves. The state can do, the more we organize ourselves, the less the state has to do. I mean, that's the simple rule. If we can manage our own tensions, if we can manage our own regulations, the state doesn't have to step into our communities. We don't have to have boots and general service units, paramilitary officers in our community. We can manage our communities for ourselves.
I appreciate what you said, all three of those things, focusing on behavior, not people, on systems, and then staying hope-based. And I think this pandemic is certainly exposing systems that needed attention before we got to this crisis. You've written about that as well, about how do we develop, our food stores and distribution systems. We would not have been caught kind of unaware at this moment, but nonetheless, here we are. And in this moment, becoming our own systems, creating systems where and I think, that's that small thing we do in our community. What you can do, what is it? Is it Mother Teresa who says, what you can't do for many, do for one? This idea, do it for somebody. What you can't do for many, we can all do something for someone in our communities. So Irungu, let's just take a moment and talk about humane policing. I think this is on everyone's mind. Yesterday, I went to see a friend who is unwell, and I was racing back to make it before curfew. Even I felt a little bit of unease. So can you give us your thoughts on humane policing in a time of a pandemic when public safety is equally intertwined with public health?
So as Amnesty International, we watched with horror the violence that unfolded at the first night of the curfew at the Likoni ferry. 16 people were hospitalized. A border rider was killed, and he was actually essentially struck as he was trying to transport somebody, and struck off his bike and beaten essentially to death. And it was just horrific. Within the first 3 weeks, we probably have seen 7 verified deaths, and the last one is last Sunday. They also include a retired police sergeant who had worked for the police service for 32 years and had then set up a butchery, and he was beaten by police officers who were about half his age, and died as a result of his injuries. So the first concern we had was that there were 2 major things. First of all, the use of lethal force and excessive force is actually unacceptable under our laws. It is not in the police standing orders, and it's definitely not in our constitution. So there is a legal infraction that has happened that requires justice. The second thing is that what it did was essentially create more fear and anxiety, like you just described. The concern is no longer getting home. It's like, am I going to get beaten by the police? And that fear and anxiety is not a healthy thing at this point in time. What we really need people to do is to observe the curfew and recognize that it takes a bit longer, particularly in those first few days, to use public transport to get home. And the police should have known that and given an allowance for at least 20 to 30 minutes or even an hour in the first couple of days for people to get used to the idea. So what we did was we and 20 other organizations released 7 guidelines to the Inspector General, and they were submitted to the Cabinet Secretary of the Interior Ministry and members of the Judiciary and also the Legislature. And what we said was that the police have to do at least 7 things. I won't go through all of them, but the key ones really is that we are now going to require the Inspector General to hold accountable the commanding officers for the behavior of their officers. It is not enough to interdict the officers on the constables who are on the beat in the streets. It is now the responsibility of the commanding officers at the police station or the divisional level to hold those officers accountable. The second thing we called for essentially was the use of non-lethal force. It doesn't make sense, absolutely doesn't make sense, to bring live ammunition into a public order management operation, particularly when you're dealing with highly dense neighborhoods. And that's how, as far as we can see, the investigation is still to be complete. The poor 13-year-old Yasin Moyo died. He died as a result of a weapon that was discharged onto his balcony as he was looking over to see what was happening. And there's no reason for that, absolutely no reason for that. There's also no reason really to be discharging volumes of tear gas into crowds that essentially forces people to vomit, to cough, to stream with tears. Those are exactly the accelerators that COVID-19 requires at that point. And it's not just from the perspective of the public we need to be worried about, but also from the police officers. Very few of the police officers have masks when they go through these operations. So actually having them exposed to people sneezing and coughing and vomiting, and then go back into very crowded Land Rovers and lorries is just a no-brainer. This should not have happened. And we continue to call the Inspector General and the National Police Service to standards that are humane, but that are also conscious of the distancing that we need to keep at this time.
And I think this is one of those things that people underappreciate about organizations like Amnesty International. This is why it's so important we have these, because as an ordinary citizen, we don't always feel like we have the ability to hold an entire police force to account. But it's so critical that human rights organizations like yourself, Human Rights Watch, are continuing to partner together to provide that accountability in a way that we as citizens cannot. That's so critical. I just want to ask you about a tangential construct related to humane policing, which is also our criminal justice system. Kenya made some decisions early on in this pandemic to anticipating the disruption to criminal justice processes. Can you highlight what you feel like they've done well in light of the pandemic to ensure that human rights remain even for those who are awaiting trial for certain cases?
Yes, I mean, I think the National Council on the Administration of Justice did very well and were very strategic in the very first week of the curfew. There would be no charging of petty offenders, and that the Inspector General should not harbour or detain suspects in police stations over this period. And I think that that has been a major significant policy directive. In many ways, if you look at places like Brazil or Ecuador, for example, where you've had prison breakouts, you've had police breakouts, you've had violence at police stations. So they got that right. And I think as Amnesty, we would congratulate them for the foresight that was required to do that so early on. Of course, one of the concerns is...
I appreciate you acknowledging also when things go well. That's so good for us to hear that as well. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that we have to drop as human rights organizations is an us and them mentality. And as Amnesty, we're not interested in that anymore. I mean, that is gone from our conversations. For every public statement that we released in most cases, there has been backdoor diplomacy to try and get the issues that we're concerned about addressed, so that we're not actually outing the Inspector General, but we're really giving him an opportunity to provide leadership at this time. I think the concern that is a creeping concern is the rise in sexual and gender-based violence, and also child defilement in this period. The very sad recognition is that for many people, women and girls and even men, husbands, homes are not safe places. They're not places where you are safe physically or even mentally. And it's really a time that we need to be thinking about, increasing helplines, counseling, and also the courts need to essentially begin to reopen, so that in the cases where we have people in harm's way that cannot go into shelters, that they can receive instant justice, and also be able to get the medical treatment, the P3 forms that they require in prosecuted, even if it is to be prosecuted in a few months from now. So there are cases of serious crimes that cannot wait for the pandemic.
Absolutely. And for anybody who's listening who knows somebody who is a victim of domestic abuse, or a child, a woman, anyone, you can call the Kenya National Hotline, which is 1195. It is toll free, 24 hours. It's in full operation. I would definitely point people there as a first line of resource. You're absolutely right, Irungu. We will probably come out of this crisis and need all of these systems to be stronger than ever, and everyone putting their hand to the task together, because there'll be a lot to maintain and to support in the coming months for sure.
Somebody said to me, there was a story that's told about Winnie Mandela, that in one of the longest periods of isolation that she had, as her husband was locked up and her children were taken away from her, she was counseled by somebody who said, remain still and look for the people who are like you and draw some strength from those people. You may not be able to contact them, you may not be able to see them, but if you can just be with them, something will show up. And it's something that's really stuck with me for over a decade now, that, that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are like us, who are looking for ways to heal the nation, to support their neighborhoods, and really looking for those people to be around with is what will give you the hope that you will need when you choose to become more despairing and perhaps more worried.
Yeah, it's hard in this time. I mean, this is a moment where everybody's paralyzed together, which makes hope something that we have to be intentional about. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think in the realm of thinking about human rights, hope does not always come into the conversation, because it's a hard thing to maintain under normal circumstances when you see significant systems failing to serve communities they were intended to serve. And yet you continue in this work. So, Irungu, as you look ahead to these uncertain weeks and whatnot ahead, what for you will remain the focus in terms of human rights? And I'd love for you to talk to me about it, both as a leader, an organization. There are many people listening to this who are also leading schools or communities or families. So as a leader, what are you thinking about in terms of preserving and promoting human rights? And then as just Irungu Houghton, Kilimani resident, dad, husband, friend, what are you thinking about as a human rights advocate?
So there's something that most people don't know about Amnesty International. Our symbol is, our logo is a candle. And it's a hope-based symbol, but it also has another side to it, which is perhaps even more profound than simply the light that comes from a candle in the darkness, which is that we light that candle for all the people that we weren't able to save. For all the people that died, for all the people whose rights have been violated, for those who've been raped and stigmatized and discriminated against, we light that candle. And what it is essentially is an affirmation of the humanity that will prevail even in times of tyranny. So I keep that, I'm not wearing it today. I usually have it as a pin on my shirt, but it just reminds me that actually humanity will prevail. And that's not a scientific statement. That is a statement of faith.
Absolutely.
Right? So in terms of our work, I think we will continue to find ways of connecting the country. I think what's important at this point is really for multi-class, multi-regional, multi-geographical solidarity and across different sectors. It's important that the state feels that it has the backing of the public when it takes actions to protect the public, and that also it has the corrective guidance of that public when it takes a misstep, and that nothing is, anti-state. It is all pro-state, and really an opportunity for government to demonstrate greatness at this point. So we will work on distance-based, distance-conscious and human rights policing at this point. We will continue to work on how to keep, our mandatory quarantine facilities and the management of our patients humane and dignified. And we will also press the government on ensuring that water and food supplies are distributed to people. It's been very exciting watching individuals and community groups rise to feed 200, 500 families, and the corporate sector to go a little bit further than that. But I think what we do need now is we do need an emergency stimulus package that targets vulnerable communities more directly. And we may need to think in terms of e-vouchers, cash transfers, rather than the physical distribution of food. So these are the areas that we will work on. As a human being without a title and really a part of the community, I think for me, I will continue to give 10 to 12 hours every day to looking at creatively how to give energy to my community, how to give energy to the country, to continue to point out the areas that we need to focus on. And even something as basic as, ensuring that our health workers and our police officers have personal protective equipment at this time is critical. And that's something that we can all take action on. I am noticing something about myself. So cabin fever shows up for all of us differently. Yes. Let me share mine. I have to interrupt a sense of impatience. And that comes from a feeling that my time is precious. It's limited. I can't waste time. And if I'm wasting time, then let it be on Netflix and while I'm asleep. That's the only two things I can do. But right. I realize that's also symptomatic of something that I'm going through, and remaining gentle and warm and compassionate at a time like this is important, not just for the Executive Director of Amnesty International, but for all of us and Irungu as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think we can all do our small thing, being engaged, being kind, being aware, being awake. During this time, it's so easy to disengage and be overwhelmed, but I think we have to stay engaged. And thank you for the way that you're staying engaged, and both as a human being as well as a leader of an important organization who we're relying on to protect human rights during this pandemic. So, Irungu, thank you for giving some of those 12 hours to me today. I'm so grateful for your service and your work and your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily. Keep uprooting and keep calling us into action.
I'll do my best. Stay well, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Thinking about human rights during this time is not easy. None of the topics we've talked about since this pandemic started have been easy, but it's important. It's important we stay awake, we stay connected. I like what Irungu said, that there's no more us and them. We are all in this together. We all have a part we can play. Check on your neighbors, hold people accountable for the small things we're doing that either make the situation better or worse. Reach out for help when you need it. The national hotline for domestic abuse is 1195. I'll have more notes in the show description where you can get a few more resources. And in particular this week, I want to highlight Food for Education. Food for Education has been working in informal settlements in Kenya for some years now. Their leader, Wairira, was recently recognized with the National Youth Prize for her dedication to making sure that kids do not go hungry when they are in school. And of course, since schools closed in March, her work has just, doubled really. And they've been doing amazing work feeding thousands of families. So if you're looking for a place to contribute, please do consider Food for Education, foodforeducation.org. All of their information is online. You can find them easily and find a way to contribute to kids and families who really need our help. Keep at it, friends. We will get through this together. I'd love to hear from you. Send me a message on Instagram or Twitter at uprootandlil, Lill. You can email me, uprootthepodcast@gmail.com. And on Facebook, it's at uprootthepodcast. Thanks so much for listening. Stay safe, stay at home, wash your hands, all that good stuff. Talk to you soon and be well, friends.